Hear more about that today as well. But there is obviously another story that continues to dominate headlines in this country and around the world, and that is the protests over the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis some 8 days ago. Today, inside the House of Commons, the Prime Minister and other party leaders will be speaking out against anti-black racism. Here is the Prime Minister of Canada.
I'll be in the House of Commons to speak about what I know is on a lot of Canadians' minds. I'll have more to say then, but for now, I want to address the role that we, as leaders and allies, have to play. As politicians, we must listen and learn about what needs to be done to fight racism, discrimination, and justice. Because being an ally is about taking a hard look at our existing systems and being committed to doing the necessary work to fix them. Our government is ready to take action. Parce que ce qu'on voit en ce moment, ce ne sont pas des cas isolés. C'est le résultat de systèmes qui, beaucoup trop souvent, tolèrent, normalisent et perpétuent l'injustice et l'inégalité à l'endroit des personnes de couleur.
This is the result of systems, and not only on the other side of the border, but here in Canada, in our communities, and in our own country. This has to stop, and people who have never been subject to discrimination or racism have a very important role to play in all of this. We have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to recognize the injustice in our lives and to take concrete action that reflects our solidarity towards other citizens.
As we move through this pandemic, I know a lot of Canadians are wondering when their community will be able to get back up and running. The short answer is that it depends on where you live and how things are going for your city or your region. That's why every province and territory has its own plan to restart. But as I said yesterday, as a country, defeating COVID-19 is something we must do together. Our government knows that, which is why I've been collaborating with the premiers on a shared approach moving forward. Yesterday, we took a first step with some funding for municipalities. Of course, help for cities and towns is just one piece of the puzzle. We know that provinces and territories also need support on securing personal protective equipment and other vital supplies. And here, too, we're stepping up. Since day one, our government has been working around the clock to secure vital PPE. Just take the fact that we've received more than 100 million surgical masks and nearly 40 million gloves, and are continuing to send a whole range of supplies to the provinces and territories. Or that we've signed a contract for millions of syringes to have the supplies needed once a vaccine is ready. Working with suppliers from around the world is key to keeping Canadians safe. But at the end of the day, one of the best ways to ensure we have what we need, well, it's to make it right here at home. Our government has been working with Canadian manufacturers to make that happen. Over half of our face shields were produced in Canada. Working with companies like Canadian Shield, which retooled to manufacture visors and went from 10 employees to 200, is a win-win. Not only do we build our capacity to make these supplies at home, we support good jobs for Canadians. And the same goes for testing. We're now funding 4 Canadian companies working on what may be breakthrough solutions for COVID-19 rapid testing. Deep Biologics in Guelph, Nicoya Life Sciences in Kitchener, Forian in Edmonton, and Metabolic Insights in Kelowna. This is on top of the support we've already provided testing, including for precision biomonitoring, as they set up a test kit manufacturing facility in Ontario. We're making huge progress, but we have to keep going. As we restart the economy, demand for supplies will go up, and Canada must be able to keep up. So whether it's N95 masks or ICU equipment, we will continue our work with the provinces and territories on the supplies we need going forward.
Whether it is to secure individual protective equipment or to support municipalities, we will continue to work with the premiers of the provinces and territories to ensure that everyone is safe. We have already distributed hundreds of thousands of items to frontline workers and began when this crisis erupted. But we also know that over the long term, one of the best ways of ensuring that we have the equipment we need is to make it right here at home. So in recent months, we have made targeted investments to increase our production capacity. Today, almost half of our facial shields are being manufactured in Canada. We've also made progress on testing. We are now funding 4 Canadian businesses whose work could allow us to make a major breakthrough when it comes to rapid testing for COVID-19. And we're also supporting the business Precision Biomonitoring in Ontario, which is setting up a plant that will produce test kits. We're moving in the right direction, but we must do more. With the economic recovery, the demand for these types of products will increase. That's normal. So we will continue to work with the provinces and territories to ensure that they have enough personal protective equipment.
To support Canadian jobs, to restart the economy, we have to work together. And it's not just as governments, but across sectors, too. Last month, we set up the Industry Strategy Council. Led by Minister Baines and chaired by Monique Leroux, their mandate is to take a deeper dive into the specific challenges and pressures that different industries are facing. Today, Minister Baines announced the Council's membership, 9 business leaders from across the country, who each represent a different pillar of our economy. This team will bring together government and industry to meet and discuss regularly as we plan our path forward.
Since this crisis began, we have noted just how important support and solidarity are. And that does not apply only to the pandemic. There are so many issues around the world that cannot be resolved by a single government or a single country. And I'm thinking of the fight against climate change, for example. That is a priority for our government, and we will continue to take action to protect the future of our children and our planet. But we cannot do that alone. And the good news is that we do not have to do it alone. For example, the Alliance, Powering Past Coal, which brings together more than 100 members around the world, is doing an amazing job to improve the quality of our air. Now, the Alliance, earlier founded by Canada and United Kingdom, will be announcing its new members, including the Desjardins movement. It will become the first North American financial institution to join that alliance. Here, Canadians are also showing the path forward, and our government will always be there to support this type of initiative.
I want to end this morning by recognizing that today is La Festa della Repubblica, which is the perfect time to wish everyone a happy Italian Heritage Month. For generations, Italian Canadians have made our country a stronger, better place. So it comes as no surprise that during this pandemic, just like always, this community is stepping up to help. Maybe you've been taking groceries over to an elderly neighbor. Or maybe you were one of many who helped raise $1 million for the Italian Red Cross. However you're lending a hand, thank you. It just goes to show that we are stronger together. The
values that embody the Italian community, hard work, family, generosity, are important to all of us. Today and every single day, we recognize the many ways this community contributes to our country and to our lives. Happy Italian Heritage Month. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Premier ministre. On va commencer la période de questions aujourd'hui par le téléphone. Opérateur, c'est à vous.
Thank you. Merci. First question, Lee Bergholm, the Canadian Press, line open.
Yes, Prime Minister, thanks for talking to us today. I would like to know what, if anything, your government plans to do to help Canadians and activists leave Hong Kong. Specifically, is Canada prepared to give pro-democracy advocates safe haven or asylum in Canada?
Canada is a country that has always welcomed people from around the world fleeing persecution and violence. We have a strong immigration system that looks at individual cases, looks at systemic challenges and responds to them, and I know our system is doing just that.
For a very long time, Canada has given refuge to people fleeing violence around the globe. And we have a system in place to look at such cases and look at the issues involved and make the right decision.
So you're not committing to any action to help Hong Kong at this point in time?
No. We continue to be
the activists in Hong Kong.
We continue to be very concerned about the situation in Hong Kong. We have 300,000 Canadian citizens who live in Hong Kong and millions of others who are fighting for justice and peace. These are things that we obviously are watching and following very carefully. We will continue to stand up for peace, for dialogue, for de-escalation of tensions, and for Beijing to engage constructively with the people of Hong Kong.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Raymond Fillon, TVA. À vous.
Good morning, Prime Minister. A question on hockey first. Will a Canadian study be able to present the playoffs, or will that be too complicated? We know there are 3 cities that are interested in bringing in the NHL players for the playoffs, but first of all, we need to ensure that we are protecting our communities and our citizens. So I know that the discussions are underway between the governments and the NHL, but it's too early to say what the result of that will be. But we understand that this is something that many people would like to see happen, but at the same time, we need to ensure that we're doing the right thing to protect Canadians.
I understand that discussions are ongoing between the NHL, the government, and public health authorities. I think everyone would love to see some games played in any number of Canadian cities. But at the same time, we need to make sure that what we're doing is keeping Canadians safe every step of the way. That's why discussions are ongoing with between public health and the interested parties.
En suivi, Raymond?
Follow up. On the situation in the U.S. now, what do you think about using the army against the protesters and using tear gas at a photo op? I think all Canadians are looking at this with concern and horror. And I think we all have to know that systemic discrimination, anti-black racism and intolerance still exist in Canada. These are acts of violence, but we're also talking about microaggression, and this is something that people face every single day. And we have to look at ourselves carefully, look at our systems, and work together to improve things here for Canadians of different origins.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir. À vous.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. On another topic, there are some foreign ministers who are asking you to publicly denounce the annexation of a certain territory by Israel. I'd like to know what your comment is on this and why you haven't been more vocal on this. Why haven't you denounced this? Well, I have been very clear that we continue to support a two-state solution and that we do not agree with unilateral action on either side. Of course, we're very worried about the annexations being proposed by the Israeli government. I made that point directly to Prime Minister Netanyahu and his alternate PM, Benny Gantz, when I spoke to them a few weeks ago. We know that the best way to address these challenges and to achieve peace in the Middle East is through dialogue among the interested parties and not through unilateral action such as this.
We are firm in our commitment to a two-state solution as a country. I have highlighted both publicly and directly to Prime Minister Netanyahu and alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz the importance of staying away from measures that are unilateral and are deep concerns and disagreement with their proposed policy of annexation. We think that the path forward is a two-state solution reached to by dialogue between the parties involved, and anything that is unilateral action by either side is unhelpful in the cause of peace.
Follow-up? Yes, as a follow-up, I understand that you're denouncing this, but is there something that Canada can do, impose sanctions, or bring pressure to bear on them? Can we go further than just denouncing this kind of action so that things don't get worse? Well, I made the point directly to Israeli leaders that we're very concerned about these actions and that we believe that this will delay and any progress and represent a barrier to any progress in the Middle East. So we must work together based on dialogue and respect, and this kind of action is of deep concern to us.
Thank you. Last question. Brett Forster, APTN National News. Line open.
Hello, Prime Minister. The final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls was released a year ago. It concluded a genocide happened and is happening in this country. Do you believe Indigenous peoples have been and remain subjected to genocide in Canada?
I think the situation that has been faced by Indigenous Canadians for decades, for generations, for centuries is appalling and needs to stop. Many people have talked about cultural genocide, used very strong words for it, and I think there are very strong words necessary to talk about the continued injustice towards Indigenous peoples that is ongoing in Canada, which is why we need to do better as a country. We need to work with Indigenous partners on the road to reconciliation. We need to be there in respect and partnership, and that is what our government has pledged to do.
As a follow-up?
Yes. What word would you use to describe this? You mentioned cultural genocide. What word would you use to describe this?
You know, I think the words that we continue to focus on is how we use reconciliation, how we use partnership, how we use shared stewardship of the land, how we reach out a hand to fix the grievous historical wrongs. We need to be focused on building a better present and future. And that means recognizing the past, but also putting in place the partnerships to move forward. There are lots of words that can be used. We need to use them, and we need to move forward.
Hi, Prime Minister. Molly Thomas, CTV National News. I was looking at the latest procurement numbers, and we have less than 10% of N95 masks that we have asked for across the globe, a fraction of the gloves and gowns that we need. How far away are we from domestically supplying everything that we need for PPE here in Canada? I mean, are we 20% there? Are we 50% there? How far along are we?
From the very beginning, we have worked extremely hard to ensure that our frontline workers and more across the country get the PPE that they need. And we have worked with partners around the globe to procure millions of items to ensure that people are protected. But at the same time, we've ramped up local production in a significant way. We've restarted domestic production of many of these items so that we don't have to be just reliant on overseas imports. That has worked very, very well. We continue to have enough supplies to supply the provinces in their needs right now. But as we reopen, we know we're going to need more as more and more industries begin to restart and need PPE. That's why we're continuing to ramp up production. We're continuing to ramp up the scale of importation. And we will continue to ensure that there is enough PPE right across the country.
Hi, Prime Minister. Tom Perry, CBC. You've been reluctant to comment on the words and actions of the U.S. president, but we do have Donald Trump now calling for military action against protesters. We saw protesters tear gas yesterday to make way for a presidential photo op. I'd like to ask you what you think about that, and if you don't want to comment, what message do you think you're sending?
we all watch in horror and consternation what's going on in the United States. It is a time to pull people together, but it is a time to listen. It is a time to learn what injustices continue despite progress over years and decades. But it is a time for us as Canadians to recognize that we too have our challenges, that Black Canadians and racialized Canadians face discrimination as a lived reality every single day. There is systemic discrimination in Canada, which means our systems treat Canadians of color, Canadians who are racialized, differently than they do others. It is something that many of us don't see, but it is something that is a lived reality for racialized Canadians. We need to see that, not just as a government and take action, but we need to see that as Canadians. We need to be allies in the fight against discrimination. We need to listen, we need to learn, and we need to work hard to figure out how we can be part of the solution on fixing things. This government has done a number of things over the past years, but there is lots more to do, and we will continue to do that because we see you, we see the discrimination that racialized Canadians live every single day.
Of course, we are watching what is happening in the United States with a great deal of concern. We know that this is a time where people have to listen and learn and take action. But here in Canada, we also are facing major challenges. Systemic discrimination exists in this country, and that means that our systems, our institutions, and everything that we have in place in this country does not provide for equal treatment of Canadians of different origins. And understanding that reality, truly understanding it, not just seeing the contrast with the United States and saying, oh, well, things are a lot better here, but actually saying we have major challenges here in Canada as well, and we have to act to eradicate them. That is what brings us today to reflect on everything we can do as individuals, as allies, to understand the lived reality of Canadians of different origins, and to be there to help them, to support them, to listen to them, to work with them, to build a life founded on respect for each other.
Why, though, are you so reluctant to comment directly on the words and the actions of the U.S. president?
My job as a Canadian Prime Minister is to stand up for Canadians, to stand up for our interests, to stand up for our values. That is what I have done from the very beginning, and that is what I will continue to do. Canadians need a government that will be there for them, that will support them, and that will move us forward in the right direction. And I will do that.
Canadians need a government that will be there to defend them and protect them and support the interests and values of Canadians. And that's what I've always done, and that's what I will always do.
The Globe and Mail, Prime Minister, in 2017, a UN report on anti-Black racism in Canada found continued conditions deplorable. They talked about the inequities that continue in Nova Scotia, for example, 30 years after segregation ended. And one of their recommendations was for your government to issue an apology for Canada's history of slavery and other historic inequalities and consider reparations. Why haven't you done that, and will you do it?
Over the past years, our government has worked very, very closely with the Black community, with members and thought leaders within the community to respond to the very many tangible things that need to be done to support Black Canadians, to counter the systemic racism, the systemic discrimination that continues to exist within Canada, within our institutions. Everything from microaggressions to acts of violence are part of the daily lived reality for far too many Canadians. And what we're seeing in the United States and what Canadians are speaking about here in Canada underlines the fact that we need to act. And acting means many things. Yes, we've created more funding for community organizations. We've invested in Statistics Canada to collect more disaggregated data. But we know that there's much more to do. We're working with the Black business community to make sure that there's better access to capital for young entrepreneurs so that there are economic opportunities going forward. We need to take a hard look at our institutions, at our structures, to ensure that those barriers that may be invisible to many of us, but far too present for Black Canadians and racialized Canadians, are addressed. There are a lot of things to do, and we will continue to work with the Black community on the things we need to do. For
a number of years now, we have been working with the Black community right across the country to respond to its needs and to address what they are experiencing every day. We have provided additional funding for community organizations. We are helping Statistics Canada to collect better data, more specific data, and we're also investing to support Black entrepreneurs from various communities. These are investments we are making to build resilience within those communities. That's very important as well. We will continue to work together with the community on the issues of concern to them, but we have a lot of work to do here in Canada.
Answer my question. My question is very specific. You say you've had time to talk to leaders in the Black community, people in the Black community, and you've had this report now for almost 3 years, and you still can't answer this question. Will you issue an apology, and will your government rule out reparations for slavery in Canada?
We will work with the Black community across this country, as we have, to respond to their priorities. There is a lot to do in Canada, and we will do it in partnership with them.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau. Louis Blouin,
Radio-Canada. Radio-Canada. Yesterday, you talked about the efforts being made to collect ethical data on various groups. Now, is there a blockage happening in certain provinces, and when can we expect to get that more specific data? We're working with the provinces on data collection at this time. This is an issue that we have been working on for some time now. Collecting ethnographic data is something we've been working on, and we're trying to address that need now. But the reality is that for much of the data we've already collected, it's much too late to go in and look at more specific, detailed information. We have to change our systems quickly to be able to do that. There's some information that Air Canada would like to get out of the transaction with Air Transat. Now, what can you tell us about that, and can you do something to ensure that Air Canada can now withdraw from that transaction? Well, we're in a difficult context at this time, and that's the case for many businesses. And we know that the decisions being made by businesses in this situation are not necessarily ideal. We will continue to work with the airline industry to support Canadian travelers, and we'll be looking at this specific situation in terms of the transaction between Air Canada and Air Transat to see what needs to be done to ensure that Canada remains a competitive country globally for airline travel.
Mr. Janet Silver, Global News. You and your government has defended the WHO repeatedly and refused to say whether you trust the data China was providing early on. Even your health minister has accused journalists of questioning the data, peddling conspiracy theories. I'm wondering, do you still believe the Chinese data can be trusted, and do you think the WHO was wrong to publicly praise the regime, even though they weren't getting the information they needed early on?
I think there are many questions that need to be asked about the WHO, about China and other countries' behaviors through this. We need to focus right now on doing everything we can to keep Canadians safe and to end this pandemic, not just in Canada, but around the world. And the WHO remains a really important partner and ally in doing that. But there are many questions that need to be answered going forward in regards to the systems we have in place and in terms of different countries' behaviors. And those questions will be asked and answered as we move forward.
Merci beaucoup. C'est ce qui m'a fait la conférence de presse d'aujourd'hui.
Merci tout le monde.
That is the Prime Minister of Canada on this Tuesday addressing the country. He's now going to head to Parliament Hill, to the West Block specifically, to take part in the COVID-19 committee, which will start at noon. And we are expecting the Prime Minister and the other leaders of parties to make remarks about the racism and the protests and the rallies that we have seen in this country, but of course in the United States. And that's where I'll bring in my colleagues, the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapellas, and the CBC's David Cochrane. So our own Tom Perry asked a question there of the Prime Minister to try and get him to respond to the remarks made by the President last night and then the behavior of the President last night, having protesters tear-gassed from the lawn of the White House so he could cross the street and head into a church, or head in front of a church, rather. It took the Prime Minister some 21 seconds to come up with a response. And it was an interesting response, and it was an interesting 21 seconds to see the Prime Minister's mind sort of click through what he could and could not say about that. Vashi, I'll start with you.
Yeah, it's interesting because normally I look down and take notes during it, and I wasn't watching it. All I heard was the pause, and I thought something was wrong with my earpiece or something, like I had lost it. It ended up being, as you said, 21 seconds before the Prime Minister answered. The question from our colleague Tom was very specific, right? It was based on, as you described, Rosie, what happened last night when the President stepped out into the Rose Garden and essentially labeled the protests and what was happening in the United States, and particularly the violent side of them, as domestic terror. That, of course, there was a lot of backlash to that. And then, as you also mentioned, sort of police unleashed tear gas and started to push protesters away in order for him to walk to a church for a photo op with a Bible. That is the specific scenario that Tom was asking the Prime Minister to comment on. And while he did pause for 21 seconds, there was no specific comment on the President or on the President's action. Instead, the Prime Minister echoed what he had said yesterday and already earlier in the press conference, which was sort of a focus on looking inward here in Canada on the systemic racism that exists here and what kinds of actions people in this country and the government and governments in this country can take. Tom followed up and said, why are you resisting, basically commenting on the U.S. President, and the Prime Minister answered that it's his job to stand up for Canadian values, which was kind of evocative as I was listening. Obviously, the situation is very different, but I remember multiple scenarios during NAFTA negotiations, for example, where the President would do something and the Prime Minister would be asked to comment directly on it, and he would talk about, you know, his job being to advance the interests of Canada, to stand up for Canadian values here, but rarely comment directly on what the President said. So that was certainly a very interesting exchange. As you said, Rosie, we are anticipating statements from him and other party leaders in the House of Commons in about half an hour's time. There was also an interesting question, I thought, from the Globe and Mail about a report out from the UN, and I had an opportunity a few months ago to read through some of that. And there were some very specific suggestions from that report, or recommendations rather, on, for example, considering reparations in this country or formally apologizing for the history of slavery in this country. Some of the other recommendations around anti-racism measures from that committee were actually implemented by the government, but as you could see from the answer from the Prime Minister, on reparations, for example, or on a formal apology, there has been no specific work done. That same committee later on also commented on some of the deficiencies in representation in political appointments for minorities in this government and in past governments. And I think that's another sort of topic that should be, discussed going forward. And I think those questions to the government are very genuine as well.
David, before I get you to weigh in, I'm going to play it again, just in case people didn't see it, and also just because I can see some discomfort on the Prime Minister's face in contemplating how he's going to respond to that. That's my interpretation. I'm not sure if that's what's happening, but anyway, here people can look and decide for themselves, and then I'll get you to weigh in. Here again is how that exchange unfolded.
Hi, Prime Minister. Tom Perry, CBC. You've been reluctant to comment on the words and actions of the U.S. president, but we do have Donald Trump now calling for military action against protesters. We saw protesters tear gas yesterday to make way for a presidential photo op. I'd like to ask you what you think about that, and if you don't want to comment, what message do you think you're sending?
We all watch in horror and consternation what's going on in the United States. It is a time to pull people together, but it is a time to listen. It is a time to learn what injustices continue despite progress over years and decades. But it is a time for us as Canadians to recognize that we too have our challenges, that Black Canadians and racialized Canadians face discrimination as a lived reality every single day. There is systemic discrimination in Canada, which means our systems treat Canadians of color, Canadians who are racialized, differently than they do others. It is something that many of us don't see, but it is something that is a lived reality for racialized Canadians.
I will say it's not just the discomfort and the sort of maybe self-censoring that he was doing in his brain about how far he could go, but even the words we watch in horror and consternation. I mean, that is not a condemnation of the president's actions, but it is certainly gives you a peek into how the Prime Minister is viewing events as they unfold in the United States, some of which are being fueled by the president's comments. David.
Yeah, it was interesting. The way Tom phrased the question, he ended it with, what message does it send if you refuse to comment on the words and actions of the president? He paused for 21 seconds and then gave a long answer that did not comment on the words and actions of the president of the United States. It has been a standard operating procedure of this government now in its second mandate to avoid direct conflict with Donald Trump whenever possible. But this is rapidly becoming a situation where we all saw this photo op where they used mounted police officers, rubber bullets, and tear gas to drive away peaceful protesters. And I should add, some of the clergy who work in that church were there providing medical aid to peaceful protesters to deal with tear gas and pepper spray. They were forced out of their church by the actions of the federal police forces, because these were not municipal Washington, D.C. police officers who did this. These were federal officers called in by the White House and the administration. They have that authority in Washington, D.C. because it is a city. It is not a state with a governor. It has a special status inside the U.S. where they have the authority to bring in their federal police officers to do this sort of thing. So we have seen criticism coming to the United States from other foreign leaders. Australia is now asking for an investigation into why a cameraman for an Australian television station was punched in the face by police officers in the events that preceded that photo op by the president. Germany's foreign minister had some comments and concerns today about what has happened to German reporters and their treatment. And we're seeing images of journalists all over the United States being targeted, roughed up, or detained by police officers. It is easy, I think, for the Canadian government to criticize, say, China for what is happening in Hong Kong, though people would say they have not been nearly forceful enough in their criticism of the Chinese regime, because things are often remote and far away. It becomes far more difficult when it is your longest standing political ally and biggest trading partner, and you're strapped right next to them just south of the border. So it seemed to me like Tom kind of staggered the Prime Minister with that question. I mean, Tom and I were both with him on the plane during the campaign, during the blackface scandal, and the Prime Minister seemed more composed at that moment and able to answer those questions than he did just now, because of the anxiety that exists at the top levels of this government of antagonizing U.S. President Donald Trump. Because let's face it, it's a time of great tension for the United States, a time of great tension for that president, and getting into his field of vision and antagonizing him is a very risky proposition for people right now, especially when we're counting on the U.S. to do things like mutually keep borders closed, because there's still a pandemic going on, even in the United States, where all of those crowds are gathering out of anger.
Yeah, and Tom did follow up, I should say.
He did.
And again, the Prime Minister said, my job is to be there for Canadians and stand up for them, and that's what I'll continue to do. But anyway, an interesting moment at an interesting time. I'll come back to both of you, Vashi and David, if you don't mind. Thank you. Part of the another question that the Prime Minister got, and this has been sort of part of the conversation that links, I think, these questions of race and the pandemic together around collecting data that better reflects race in this country, that reflects race at all in this country, frankly. There have been lots of questions to the Prime Minister, to ministers, to the public health officer about why that doesn't happen, what limitations that has then on showing us how the pandemic may have affected communities differently inside this country. Arjuman Siddiqui is an associate professor at the University of Toronto's Dalla Lana School of Public Health, and she joins me now. So good to see you. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
So we have been sort of on and off talking about this through the pandemic. I think it was first raised around Indigenous communities, where we have certainly a picture of things for Indigenous people, First Nations people on reserve. But it continues to be an obvious hole, I would say, in our understanding of the pandemic. Can you tell me why that exists? Why is that hole there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I haven't been able to figure that out entirely, except that it is true that there seems to be a reluctance in Canada to document what's happening in our own society on a sort of axis of life, race, that is so clearly embedded in all aspects of our society. So it's unfortunate that we're sort of this reluctant to put evidence and facts behind what we think and are quite certain to be true. But I'm not sure exactly why we do this.
Yeah, I mean, the Prime Minister was asked about it yesterday, too, and he said it's sometimes even hard, because a lot of the times the federal government's relying on the provinces, it's sometimes even hard to get age and gender. Forget about the race, which is also an issue. So tell me how that information, the race-based information, would help us contain the pandemic, would help us make systemic changes to healthcare, any of those things.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think if we look at places where data on race are readily available, namely the United States, it's clear that two things are happening. One is that you have the ability to say a lot about A, what the situation is, and B, what could be done to make the situation better. And then to say, okay, let's reflect on what our society is actually doing in relation to what the data, the facts suggest we should be doing in order to combat these inequities. On the other hand, it's also clear from the United States that the data isn't enough. It's not that advocating for race-based data is this sort of pie-in-the-sky attitude that if we only have the data, then we'll fix everything. No, not at all. It's that the data helps us to hold policymakers accountable. It helps us to understand our own society and then to have facts as an engine for the discourse about what's happening to racialized groups in Canada, particularly Black and Indigenous peoples.
Well, I would imagine for policymakers, too, it would just help them make better decisions, right? I mean, if you can focus in on a neighborhood where people are affected differently, you can make better policy. Wouldn't it be as simple as that?
One would hope so. Would hope so. You know, sometimes data and facts help policymakers make decisions, and they make decisions according to data and facts, and sometimes they don't. So at the very least, it helps us to understand what the facts are in relation to what policies are being made. But you're quite right that hopefully it would help us make better decisions.
There are some places where we're getting this picture. The City of Toronto has now revealed some information around neighborhoods. Montreal, the island of Montreal, we've done some reporting on how different communities are hit, and we know sort of the population makeup there, so we're able to extrapolate certain things. Would you? Obviously, you'd like to see more of that, but how would that information then be used by people like you in understanding things?
Yeah, so definitely would like to see more of that. And I think there's two parts to that. One is to have more regular collection of race-based data, but also greater accessibility. So the other way that Canada often lags is that the data they collect often only goes to a sort of small set of people who then do a sort of circumscribed look at the data, instead of letting the data sort of become part of the living conversation that's being had by the media, by scientists, and so on. So scientists like me use that data to try to ask deep questions about how policies are affecting communities, whether we should be making different decisions. And it's really important because as scientists, we have some independence and we aren't sort of fueled to the same extent by particular agendas. And so it's really important that we have access to the data so that we can sort of provide a clear indication to Canadians, to the media and to the public about what's happening in Canadian society, who's being affected, how can we change that, and so on.
So the only place really right now where we get that, I guess, is the census in any detailed way. Is it racism itself, the fact that we don't gather this information? Is it as simple as that, or is it discriminatory? Like, how would you characterize it?
Yes, I think the best way to characterize it is that the people who have the institutional capacity to make decisions about what data we collect and what data we don't are not affected by these issues and may even have some incentives not to have the facts out there for the public. And so the incentive to have the data to show systematically and factually what's happening in terms of inequalities in Canadian societies across racial groups, it's likely to be very damning evidence, very damning in terms of the facts that are presented. And at the very least, I think you can sort of surmise that the people making decisions around this sort of think twice about whether they actually want these facts out there.
Okay, Arjumand Siddiqui, thank you so much. It's a conversation we've been wanting to have for some time. You are the exact right person to talk to. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. That's Arjumand Siddiqui. She's an associate professor at the University of Toronto's Dalla Lana School of Public Health. All right, we did hear there from the Prime Minister on the country's ongoing attempts to sort of beef up our PPE, our personal protective equipment. We know that that is happening through purchases in other countries, but also through shoring up a domestic supply chain. It has now become even more important, not only for the frontline workers, medical communities, but also people in private businesses, because they are also in need of PPE as economies start to reopen across the country. Karen Bibeau works for Logistic Unicor in Quebec. It's a uniform and safety equipment manufacturer, and the company has also signed an agreement with the federal government to mass produce medical protective gowns for healthcare workers. Good to see you, Karen.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being there. So you signed the contract with the government, and I know gowns, not something we talk about probably as much as masks, but also extremely important right now. How many gowns were you commissioned to make? Where are you at with that contract?
Well, the contract we have is for a 6 months period. So we were contracted for more than 11 million gowns.
Okay, and how difficult, you were already doing this kind of work, but how difficult was it to move from what you were doing to what you're doing now?
Well, our specialty is uniform. So we're doing, obviously not necessarily medical. This is a new niche. So, but we were quite happy. We have a great supply chain across Canada. We were already producing 80% of our items here in Canada. So we were able to change a direction of most of our suppliers to produce from uniform items to gowns.
And as I said, we talk a lot about masks and a lot about gloves, not so much about gowns. What's your understanding of how important they are, how needed they are for frontline workers?
They're very important. It allows protection for water penetration and hydrostatic pressure. So it's extremely important, and there's different levels of gowns. So level 1 would be for, front workers, and then 2 and 3. So as the risk increases, then you have a different type of gown, which has a different type of fabric and a different type of sewing to increase protective. But we're also doing a lot of washable gowns as well as disposable. So there's something that can be reused.
Interesting. How if you hadn't got this contract with the government, was it on the verge of being affected anyway by the pandemic, or were you going to be able to continue producing? What are some of the challenges you faced as a company?
Well, we support around 4,500 workers in our subcontractors in Canada. So unfortunately, the situation was a lot of our clients had reduced operations. However, we were a company that was essential services because we addressed the National Defence, for example, Canada Post. So we were operating, but at a little lower capacity. So this was helped a lot of our subcontractors to reopen, to produce these gowns and supporting jobs and supporting the economy. So it was a great thing. We're quite glad, as well as we had the expertise on hand. We have an in-house lab. We have expertise in textiles. So we were able to turn around quite quickly using Canadian-made fabric and even producing it locally really quickly.
You do, as you said, things for National Defence and Canada Post, so you're already sort of contributing to the country. But is this different? Have you heard from your employees about how they feel about contributing to keeping people safe during a pandemic and being part of that sort of Canadian team approach?
Absolutely. I was actually at the warehouse where we're cutting some fabric for some of our suppliers, and I was talking to one of my employees. She says, I wake up every morning and I'm happy we're contributing to this cause and we're helping. So a lot of our suppliers, some of them open during the weekends. When we call them, the first time there was a requirement, it was during Easter weekend. So we call them and they reopened quite quickly to help. So it was a great thing. I think it was the community of the industry helped each other in this time.
Yeah, it is nice to see. It is one of the sort of small silver linings in all of this. Karine Bibeau, thank you for making the time. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much.
That's Karine Bibeau, VP of Sales for Logistic Unicor in Quebec. They are now making medical gowns for frontline workers. Okay, I want to try and squeeze in one more interview if we can before, first of all, the noon briefing with cabinet ministers, including the Deputy Prime Minister and public health officials. But we are also expecting the COVID-19 committee to take place also starting around noon. That will start off with the Prime Minister and other party leaders inside the West Bloc there, inside the Commons, making comments about race and racism and in light of what we are seeing in the United States and how that has sort of bled over into this country and some of the calls for action in Canada as well from Black Canadians. Let's talk now about another way that we are in this country trying to find a way to move forward and contain the pandemic. Dr. Prabhuhat Jha is an epidemiologist based in Toronto, and he's leading a study that's testing the blood of 10,000 Canadians for checking for COVID-19 antibodies, which is so interesting and is part of really how we will get out of all of this. Nice to see you, Doctor.
Thank you, Rosemary.
So explain to us what you are doing, how you're testing Canadians, and what you're looking for.
Well, we're trying to understand a very simple question, which is how many Canadians are infected with the virus that causes COVID? And to do so, what we will do is work with a reputable polling company, Angus Reid Polling Company, and select within their polling operations roughly 10,000 or more Canadians who will be asked to fill a simple online form, whether they've had symptoms, and ask if they would agree to receive a simple kit at home, which we would send them. And then what they do is they do a little finger prick and put it on special paper and mail it back to us. And then we would be testing for antibodies to see if there is infection or past infection against the virus that causes COVID. And we want to do this right across the country. And in particular, we want to get a good sample of older Canadians because those are the groups that have been the most vulnerable to the effects of the virus.
So so it's not necessarily people who had COVID, tested positive. It's people who maybe had symptoms. Is that right?
That's right. Well, it's actually, we want to get everyone. One of the problems of understanding the epidemic is if you simply rely on the test results, like, the swab that they do of your nose, those are done mostly by people who are sick or very health conscious seeking. So you don't get a true snapshot of what's happening in the population. So what we're interested to do is ask everyone, whether they have symptoms or not, if they would contribute to the study. And what we have said in turn is the results of the assay of the test will give back to the people. So we'll be able to tell them whether they've been definitely or highly likely to have been infected, somewhat likely to have been infected, or unlikely. And the reason we have that scale is we don't want people to say these are immunity passports. I can go around and people on the street. And it will give us a very good sense of how many Canadians are infected, what's the distribution across the country. And because we plan to ask people, can we come back to you in 6 months, we'll be able to answer a key question saying, if, let's say, I've got antibodies against the virus, how long does it last? Does it fall quickly like the common cold virus, or does it stick around longer? And that's a key question that helps us prepare for a potential second wave.
How quickly can you get this done, Doctor? I mean, I should say I haven't had symptoms of COVID, thankfully, but I have, like many people, wanted to know if I have antibodies or if I, have become sort of quote unquote immune to it. So how quickly can you get this done? Because I'm sure lots of Canadians would be interested in knowing the answer to this question.
Yes, well, there's two ways to reply to that. One is we want to get this out quickly, as you've outlined in your show. We think that most infections in Canada had peaked in April, and typically it takes about a month before your body starts producing the antibodies that fight the virus, and you show it in your blood. So that would be about mid-May, and we don't know whether it falls very quickly or it sticks around. But if we assume it falls quickly, we need to get the samples in quickly. So that's what we're hoping to get the kits out starting this week and into next. And then the testing strategies have to be done very carefully, because you don't want kind of wrong results or misleading results, like has happened in some of the US studies. So we'll do that very carefully, drawing upon Health Canada approved tests and others. And the goal is perhaps by the end of June, early July, we can start to get some results from the study.
Great. That is very quick, of course, for everything's happening at a rapid speed in the scientific world right now. Let me end on this question, and you sort of alluded to it, that once people have this information, they shouldn't then assume that they are immune to the virus, or that they can walk around and not physically distance or not wear a mask. That is not the right way to interpret the information. Is that right?
That's right. I think what we're asking for Canadians in the study to do is to help share their data. They get some information which would be helpful to them, but by sharing their data, we'll get information that protects our seniors and the most vulnerable. So this is one of the things in a war on COVID, we all have to be good citizens, and by sharing the blood, we're able to get an insight as to how we can best fight the virus. So, and protect particularly seniors, because that's been the big worry, is hospitalization and deaths in our older citizens, and what are the ways of preventing that.
All right, Dr. Prabhat Jha, what amazing work you're doing. Good luck with it all. We'll maybe check back with you in a number of weeks, if you don't mind. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, Prabhat Jha is an epidemiologist, and he is in Toronto. If you want to check in on the situation in Quebec, I should tell you that there is a briefing happening right now with the Quebec Premier. You see him there, François Legault. We are waiting for the federal briefing, but if you want to watch this one, you can always do that. CBC.ca is where we stream briefings across the country that might be happening in your province, depending on the situation. Quebec still under some pressure, although its testing numbers have gone up significantly, and that is encouraging. So CBC.ca is where you can continue to watch that. I'm Rosemary Barton, though, here in Ottawa, as we wait for our federal briefing today with the Deputy Prime Minister and other ministers and public health officials to talk more about some of what the Prime Minister alluded to in his briefing to the country about an hour ago, specifically updates on the state of PPE acquisitions here, meaning that personal protective equipment that we have been trying to procure from different countries, and to create in our own countries. You heard from our previous guest, who's now switched to making medical gowns. So we'll hear more from the Minister of Procurement, Anita Anand, and we are also standing by to bring you inside the House of Commons, where we are expecting the Prime Minister and Leader of the Official Opposition and others to make speeches in reaction to this call to look at racism both inside our country and elsewhere, obviously spurred by the death that happened just a week or so ago in the United States, but now which has led to widespread protests across the U.S. and indeed some inside this country too. I'll bring in my colleagues as we wait for that briefing and the other to get underway. The host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapelis, and the CBC's David Cochran. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about procurement. We are expecting to hear more from the minister about where we are at with that. It doesn't seem like, I would say that the pressure or the complaints from provinces have really sort of tempered off, and that might be because we are now sort of in a different place with this pandemic. But there is a shift now to trying to get equipment for private industry, regular citizens, things that they need that are not necessarily medical grade, Vashi.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister acknowledged that, and premiers have too over the past few weeks, this idea that as the economy reopens or opens up to a certain degree, the need for that personal protective equipment will increase. I thought it was interesting how the Prime Minister framed it sort of in the vein of the announcement yesterday on municipalities. This is part and parcel of how maybe jurisdictional issues are being smoothed over, and the provinces and the Prime Minister or the federal government are working together to try and secure that PPE. He offered a little bit of an update on some of that procurement. So, for example, 10 million gloves, 100 million surgical masks. There are still issues. There wasn't an update there, and so I'll be looking for that in this briefing on N95 respirators. We know that of the millions that we've ordered, a large percentage haven't even arrived, and a large percentage of the ones which have arrived aren't up to Canadian standards. So curious to see what Minister Anand has to say on that. The other update that I'm looking for in this briefing comes from Minister Navdeep Bains, and that's around something that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. It was just announced about a month ago, this idea of like an industry strategy council. And my understanding is the members of that council are going to be announced today, but also I think that will give us an indication of what industries they're looking at. And the reason that I raise it as sort of an area for us to pay attention to is because airlines, for example, the tourism industry, we know there are particular industries, even oil and gas, which have been hit extra hard. I mean, everyone has been hit, but those industries in particular will see the effects of this pandemic last for years, according to Air Canada, for example. So what suite of measures is the government considering for those industries beyond the programs that they've already offered? So beyond, for example, the big loans, rather, to big companies in this country. I spoke with the Transport Minister last week. They haven't ruled out a quote-unquote bailout for airlines. Will this group be looking at that? I think we might get an idea of sort of maybe where the group is heading or what they're going to be looking at, what possible measures are, just by who comprises the group, and we'll learn that as well. So that's something I'm looking out for too.
Yeah, that's a good one to watch for. David, anything that you'll be listening intently for?
Yeah, one of the big concerns last week with the Meng Wanzhou decision in British Columbia about her attempt to have her extradition case thrown out was whether or not China would change its posture in terms of dealing with Canada in the delivery of PPE supplies. I know we've had some problems with quality with the N95 respirators that have come out of there, but it is still an important part of the supply chain for Canada as it tries to backstop from a federal level the supplies at the provincial level and soon in industry. And I've been speaking with some government sources on this over the last little while, and apparently to their relief, there has been no change. There was some concern that when Meng lost her attempt to have the decision thrown out and still faces the possible extradition to the United States, that, in retaliation for what's happening with the Huawei executive, that there might be restrictions or more difficulty in getting into China, getting into Shanghai, getting materials to the warehouse and getting them on the plane and then getting them out. To this point, they have not seen any interruption in that. So that is a good thing. On the actual supply thing, I think Vashi is quite right when she says we haven't sort of heard the urgent cries from provinces, so it seems like it has stabilized. The big thing is the 3M supply of N95s coming from the United States.
Got to cut you off, David, only because the Prime Minister has started inside the House. I'll come back to you right after. Here now, again, the Prime Minister inside the House of Commons speaking.
Problems. Prejudice, discrimination, and violence is a lived reality for far too many people. It is a result of systems which far too often condone, normalize, perpetrate, and perpetuate inequality and injustice against people of color. As a country, we are not concerned bystanders simply watching what is happening next door. We are part of it. The calls for justice, for equality, for peace have found echo in our communities because anti-Black racism is happening here, everywhere in Canada, every single day. This is something that our own staff, cabinet ministers, and colleagues face even in these halls. Over the past few days, I've heard many of these personal stories directly from them. And I'm not just talking about acts of violence, I'm also talking about microaggressions, which many of us may not even see. That is the daily reality of far too many racialized Canadians, and it needs to stop. When it comes to being an ally, I have made serious mistakes in the past. Mistakes which I deeply regret and continue to learn from. And I want to thank my colleagues, community leaders, and fellow Canadians for opening my eyes to what is really going on in our communities and helping me better understand both privilege and power. I'm not perfect, but not being perfect is not a free pass to not do the right thing. It's not an excuse to not step up, to stand up for each other, to be an ally. I know that for so many people listening right now, the last thing you want to hear is another speech on racism from a white politician. I'm not here today to describe a reality I do not know or speak to a pain I have not felt. I'm here because I want you to know that our government is listening. We hear your calls for justice, equality, and accountability. We acknowledge your frustration, your anger, your heartbreak. We see you.
Since coming to power, our government has taken several concrete steps to fight anti-Black racism, systemic discrimination, and injustice across our country. We are working directly with communities and their leaders to bridge persistent gaps in Canada. For example, we granted $9 million to support programs for young Black Canadians. We have made sizable investments to allow the Public Health Agency to offer more mental health services to those who have experienced racism or intergenerational trauma. We are helping community organizations to obtain funding for the purchase of equipment or for rentals. We created the Anti-Racism Secretariat with a budget of $4.6 million to eliminate systemic obstacles, particularly in terms of employment, justice, social participation, which perpetuate injustice. We have made some progress, but we know that this work is far from over.
Over the past 5 years, our government has worked with communities to recognize and address injustices. We've taken action to support community organizations, invest in better data, and fight racism. And while we've made some progress, there is still so much more to do. Because here are the facts in Canada. Anti-Black racism is real. Unconscious bias is real. Systemic discrimination is real. For millions of Canadians, it is their daily lived reality. And the pain and damage it causes is real, too. Mr. Speaker, every Canadian who has felt the weight of oppression, every student who has the courage to demand a better future, every person who marches and posts and reads and fights from Vancouver to Montreal to Halifax expects more than the status quo. They expect more and deserve better.
The government of Canada has much work to do, but we're ready for it. We're ready to work with our colleagues from the opposition, with community leaders, and with Canadians to make our country a more equal and fair place. There is never any place for racism here, and we are going to stop at nothing to eradicate it from coast to coast. Thank you, Chair.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Over the past week, we have all been affected by the heartbreaking killing of George Floyd in the United States. The video is painful to watch. No one should ever have to plead for help while a crime is being committed, ignored by other members of law enforcement. La tragédie a déclenché des marches.
This tragedy has sparked marches, sit-ins, protests, and sadly, in some cases, riots. But I hope, most importantly, that it has sparked conversations. Racism is real, it is painful, and it is unacceptable.
Mr. Speaker, the tragedy has sparked marches, sit-ins, protests, and sadly, in some cases, riots. But I hope, more importantly, it has sparked conversations. Racism is real, it is painful, and it is wrong. No one should ever feel unsafe because of the color of their skin, especially around police officers who have a duty and responsibility to uphold the law for all. And here in Canada, we are fortunate to live in a country that is welcoming, tolerant, and inclusive. Canada was a beacon of freedom to so many escaping slavery during the U.S. Civil War. Our nation has benefited immensely from great Canadians who overcame prejudices and discrimination to serve their communities and make Canada a better country. Lincoln Alexander, elected as a Conservative in 1968, was the first Black Member of Parliament and went on to become the first Black Cabinet Minister. John Ware was born into slavery in South Carolina, but following the American Civil War, was a leading figure in bringing the first cattle to Alberta and spearheading the ranching industry that would become the backbone of the province. Josiah Henson, who escaped slavery to become a thriving businessman in Ontario. And of course, Viola Desmond, who challenged segregation in Nova Scotia. Black Canadians throughout history have not just built this nation with their contributions, they have also represented Canada with excellence and pride on the world stage. Like Harry Jerome, who represented Canada in 3 Olympic Games and won a bronze medal in 1964. He would go on to become a teacher in British Columbia, once again serving with excellence to try to make a better world for the next generation. And throughout our history, Black Canadians have put their lives on the line for their fellow Canadians, bravely serving around the world in our armed forces. While there are many things we can point to in our history with pride, that is not to say that we have a perfect record. Nor are we immune to the threat of racism or that anti-Black racism is just an American problem. Canada has had its own dark episodes of racism that cannot be ignored, and sadly, not just in our past. Every day, there are people who experience discrimination or racism in some form. Throughout this pandemic, we have seen a troubling spike in anti-Asian racism. No one should be attacked in their community or targeted on the bus because of the color of their skin. Nor should places of worship be broken into and desecrated like the synagogue in Montreal.
Conservatives condemn all acts of anti-Semitism, racism, and discrimination. In a peaceful and free country like Canada, there is absolutely no place for intolerance, racism, or extremism of any kind.
Conservatives condemn all acts of anti-Semitism, racism, and discrimination. But the violence and the destruction we have seen in response are not the answer. Millions of people are protesting peacefully across the United States and in Canada. And we must always protect the rights of people who are protesting peacefully and within the law for a just cause, and separate them from those who exploit tragedies to commit acts of violence. As Mr. Floyd's brother Terrence said, violence will not bring his brother back. Instead, he has called for peace and justice and urged the crowds to educate themselves and to vote. Out of such tragedy, Mr. Speaker, that is a powerful message about how each and every one of us can use our democratic rights to effect change. In a peaceful and free country like Canada, there's absolutely no room for intolerance, racism, and extremism of any kind. We are not born believing that we are better than one another. We are all created in the image and likeness of God, and because of that, we are all equal, and infinite value exists in each and every one of us. Canada is an incredibly diverse country. Canada is a nation of immigrants that stands on the traditional territories of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Waves of newcomers have come to Canada for a better life because our country is built on a rock-solid foundation of enduring values, democratic institutions, the rule of law, and fundamental and universal human rights.
They all came here because Canada is built on solid values, democratic institutions, and respect for the rule of law, and fundamental and universal human rights.
Protect these values because they are what set us apart. They allow Canada to offer what so many other countries simply cannot. There are those who say that diversity is our strength, and that is true, but it doesn't quite capture the full picture. Diversity is the result of our strength, and our strength is, and always has been, our freedom.
Our diversity is the result of our strength, and our strength is, and will always be, our freedom.
The freedom for people to preserve and pass on their cultural traditions, and the opportunity to live in peace with those around them. The freedom to live your life with equality under the law, regardless of your race or ethnic background. And the economic freedom that so many governments around the world deny their people. It is that economic freedom that ensures that hard work pays off, that gives people the ability to work towards their dreams and choose their own path in life. Together, generations of Canadians who trace their roots back to countries around the world have built Canada into truly the greatest country on earth, a true north, strong and free.
In order to ensure that we remain as a people free, we must continue to fight efforts to infringe upon our freedoms, including racism and all forms of brutality and injustice in Canada and around the world. Minorities' rights must be protected. Religious freedoms must be protected. Freedom of expression and the right to protest peacefully must be protected.
In order to ensure that we, as a people, remain free, we must continue to fight efforts to infringe upon our freedoms, including racism and all forms of brutality and injustice in Canada and around the world. Minority rights must be protected. Religious freedoms must be protected. Freedom of expression and the right to peaceful protest must be protected. As John Diefenbaker said, I am Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship in my own way, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I believe wrong, and free to choose those who shall govern my country. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all mankind. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
The honourable member for Belley-Chambly. Thank you very much, Chair.
George Floyd
is not a victim of racists, but another victim of racism. At a time of crisis, when contempt causes us to be afraid of disease, for thousands of people who are taking to the streets to express their outrage, here in the political sphere, we're going to have to be cautious once again in terms of the words we choose, because we're particularly given to interpreting the words of others. Today, our duty, and almost our only duty, is to express our solidarity and our sadness, our indignation, our anger, but also, and most importantly, to all my friends, I would say, from the wonderful Black community in Quebec, our friendship. We have to try to be heard by all humans. And every time we talk about this, there's a part of me that comes out, the kind of unofficial anthropologist that I am, reminds me that races don't exist. There are certain genetic traits that manifest themselves that create cultures. Racism expresses first and foremost through the aggression of what we presume to be the culture of others, differences that all too often, when they frighten others, are too many. We have to learn to live equally, fairly, in our diversity, which in itself is something extraordinary. Governments in the U.S. have all been racist. And racism was obviously expressed through their history and in their institutions. This has left a trace. And this is the only thing we can call systemic racism and systemic discrimination. I'm concerned that anyone who suggests that we're all collectively involved in systemic discrimination, or anyone who thinks that they are a virtuous barrier between ourselves and our victims. I don't think the Canadian government is racist, the Quebec government is racist, I don't think our municipalities are racist either. But there can be traces of odious things in our institutions. And these taint our relationships with people who are of various origins or people who have been here before us. So systemic racism does probably exist. We can't point out people, but we have to review our rules to extract what can be discriminatory. But today belongs to George Floyd. Today belongs to blacks in the U.S. Today it belongs to blacks in Quebec and in Canada. We're not going to do politics at the doors of a funeral. We are going to allow the indignation and sadness in the U.S. express itself, and will allow those who need to speak with one voice in peace. All those who are peaceful are legitimate, and nothing that is violent is legitimate. The Prime Minister announced his desire for concrete measures to fight racism. The first measure should be to show our solidarity and friendship. And I would propose as a priority and to quickly process files for asylum seekers, particularly here from black individuals and people of other origins as well, who expressed their desire to participate in the Quebec nation. We have the power and the duty to do so. And let's do it tomorrow. Let's do it right away. Thus, we'll be able to put our words into action. And this will make us more credible. In the meantime, our duty is to stand up for those who are afraid, stand up against those who are making them afraid. Thank you, Chair.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Many Canadians were shaken to see the violence due to the murder of George Floyd. The murder of George Floyd reminds us that racism, anti-black racism, is still very present and hits hard. Anti-black racism is not only present in the U.S., it is here in Canada as well. Systemic racism to blacks, Indigenous peoples, and other visible minorities is present. racial profiling, economic inequalities, social inequality, hiring discrimination, and
so much. Merci beaucoup. Okay, thank you very much, Anita. And now we will hear from our Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, Navdeep Bains. Nav, please.
And good afternoon. From the very beginning,
quand vient le temps d'agir, et non pas le courage, et non pas la volonté d'agir. Les gens ressentent beaucoup de douleur et de frustration, mais nous pouvons transformer cela en action et en justice. Nous devons faire plus
we have to do more than just calling for peace. I think we have to call for justice. Justice is the only path to creating a better world.
When people around the world saw the killing of George Floyd, it left all of us shaken to our core. It was chilling. The casual violence of anti-Black racism. The callous taking of another human being's life. It hurt to the core. There was pain, there was sadness, and rightly so, there is anger. There is frustration. This isn't just an American problem, this is just as much a Canadian problem as well. And something that continues to exist across our country. Anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism is real. People have suffered in violence. Indigenous people, Black people have suffered violence and have been killed at the hands of police here in Canada. I think about Regis Korchinski-Paquette in Toronto and the calls for justice for Regis, a trans Black woman who was killed in suspicious circumstances in interaction with the police. I think about Stuart Kevin Andrews, a young Indigenous man killed in an interaction with the police in Winnipeg. And the anger and the frustration is how many more people need to die before there's action? How many more speeches will be made? How many more protests need to happen before something is done? How many more times will people plead to breathe? How many more times will they plead to live? What we're talking about is basic human dignity. How many more voices have to ask, demand, plead, beg for basic human dignity? People are angry. They're feeling like enough is enough. Why do they need to keep on asking? Why do Black people, why do Indigenous people need to keep on asking to be treated like a human? Why? You know what? People are done with pretty speeches, particularly pretty speeches from people in power that could do something about it right now if they wanted to. I'm standing in a hall of power, in the Chamber of Commons, with a Prime Minister who has the power to not just say pretty words, to actually do something about this. The Prime Minister of this country has the power to go beyond pretty words and pretty speeches and do something. Now, I don't have all the answers. I don't think any one person does. We're going to have to come up with those solutions together. But there are certainly some things that we do know. Martin Luther King said, "Peace is not merely the absence of tension. Peace is the presence of justice." That's what we need. We need justice. Killer Mike extolled that people should plan, plot, strategize, organize, and then mobilize. Cardi B put it this way: another way for the people to take power, and I don't want to make everything political, but it is what it is by voting. So what do we vote for? We vote for a government to take action. So I call on the Prime Minister in this hall of power, if the Prime Minister believes that Black lives matter, will the Prime Minister commit to ending racial profiling in our country? If the Prime Minister believes that Black Lives Matter, will the Prime Minister commit to ending the over-policing of black bodies? If the Prime Minister truly believes that Black Lives Matter, will the Prime Minister commit to ending the over-incarceration of black people in this country? Now, if the Prime Minister truly believes that Black Lives Matter, will he commit to ensuring that there's race-based data to make better decisions? Will he commit to ensuring that there's access to education, to health resources? The Prime Minister has the power to do all these things right now. The Prime Minister simply needs to get it done. If the Prime Minister truly believes that Indigenous lives matter, then similarly, the Prime Minister must commit today to ending the racial profiling of Indigenous people, the over-policing of Indigenous people, and the over-incarceration of Indigenous people. If the Prime Minister truly believed that Indigenous lives matter, the Prime Minister could stop taking Indigenous kids to court. The Prime Minister could stop delaying the action on the calls for justice for the murdered, missing, and Indigenous women and girls. If the Prime Minister believed that Indigenous lives matter, he could ensure that there's clean drinking water, access to justice, and education, and housing right now. People are angry because they're frustrated and done with pretty words. People are angry because they're done with pretty speeches from people in power who could do something about it right now. People don't want peace. They don't want an absence of tension. People want the presence of justice. People want justice. People deserve justice. People need justice, and justice is what people will get. Nothing less will do. Thank you.
All right, and those are statements from leaders inside the House.
Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
As they respond to the protests, the anti-racism protests that we have seen in this country and in the U.S. Let's go now, though, to the briefing in Ottawa, where cabinet ministers and public health officials are going to take some questions, and we've arrived just in time for that. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland.
Journalists serve the people. Speaking from my own experience in government, I cannot say that every single question that I am asked by a journalist is welcome or easy to answer. But I am absolutely convinced that the fact that journalists are present to bear witness, the fact that journalists are present to hold governments to account, makes governments better. So freedom of the press is an essential human right, and it is an essential element in making democracy strong.
En français, s'il vous plaît, Madame la Vice-Présidente.
In French now, please, Deputy Prime Minister. That is a very good question. As a journalist and a politician today, I've reflected a great deal on this issue. I must say that as a politician, I cannot say that I warmly welcome every single question that I receive. There are difficult questions, obviously. However, I can say that I'm more persuaded now than ever that having strong journalism and freedom of the press is essential for democracy. Because of the presence of journalists to bear witness to what is happening, who are present and have the power to ask questions of the government, every democracy, including ours, is stronger. Journalists and journalism are essential for democracy. Thank you.
Lee, follow up.
And this question is for Minister Anand. The government has ordered close to 40,000 ventilators, but only 203 have arrived, a number that's remained largely the same for weeks now. Is there a problem? And in terms of KN95 masks, millions have been redirected outside the healthcare system. Where exactly are they being redirected? And are you allowing the resale of them to the public?
Thank you so much for those two questions. The first question relating to ventilators is a good one. You're right, we have received just over 200 ventilators. The contracts that we have in place for a large portion of the remainder are in place with Canadian manufacturers, as both Minister Baines and I have discussed at these pressers in the past, and they will be arriving over the next months as these companies, some of which are retooling, some of which are starting up to do the ventilator production, are doing just that. And so you will see the numbers of ventilators on our chart on our website increasing over the next months. I will say that those ventilator procurements are in addition to the existing stock of ventilators that the Public Health Agency of Canada has. And of course, provinces and individual healthcare systems are making their own procurements across a range of PPE and other items as well. Moving on to KN95 masks, close to 2 billion masks have been redeployed to other areas of government. At this point, there is no plan to make those available for retail use. I want to remind you and everyone that we are still in the middle of the crisis, especially from a procurement perspective. And all of our procurements at the current time are based on federal and provincial orders that have come into us for delivery out to the healthcare system. There is a demand for PPE outside of the healthcare system, and we are currently devising a means by which we can be more broad-based in terms of supplies and use of PPE across Canada. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister. Operator, next question, please.
Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, is from Manon Cornelier avec Le Devoir. Please go ahead, à vous la parole.
Question from Le Devoir. Mr. Baines, this question is for you. You announced the composition of your Industry Strategy Council. Just a moment, please. Now, on the Industry Strategy Council, that will help you to consider future perspectives. But what about workers? Are they not part of the industrial strategy? They're just going to be subject to the implementation of these strategies?
Hello?
Il est en train de répondre.
Oui,
Nav, go for it.
Yes, he is answering now.
Merci pour votre question.
Thank you for your question. The Council represents all industry throughout Canada. Our objective is very clear. We must have a strategy that can help the situation for workers, that can improve it. It's not just about the sectors, it's about the workers. Our strategy represents opportunities to have good conversations with workers as well. That is why we've mobilized leaders of every industry that can propose solutions for workers. Question, the workers, you don't want to hear from them? There's no union, there's no workers group represented on your council. Answer. Once again, the Council represents industry. It represents the private sector. The private sector creates the right atmosphere for workers. We will mobilize workers through unions throughout Canada. Absolutely, yes. I will work with my colleagues at Cabinet as well. And we will engage unions throughout Canada. Thank you, Mr. Minister. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, is from Alex Ballingall with the Toronto Star. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hi, thanks so much for taking my question. Just on the syringe order, when will these syringes start arriving? And just the second part of that for Dr. Tam, if I can, do you think that in order for a vaccine to be effective, that it needs to be mandatory that, we have 37 million syringes coming in, that basically all of Canada must be vaccinated when this arrives?
Thank you so much, Alex, for that question. The contract with Becton Dickinson for the syringes is a new contract, and the delivery schedule is still being determined. But I will say that we are planning ahead for the eventual discovery of a vaccine. So the need for those syringes at this very moment is not as high as we are seeing across other PPE items. Having said that, we are working to procure supplies, including those syringes and other supplies that would be needed for the eventual discovery of a vaccine and its administration throughout Canada. But for the health aspect of that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Tam, who may have more to say on vaccine administration.
Yeah, so I think we don't know if we'll have an effective vaccine, but we need to plan ahead for that eventuality. So we have a committee, the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, that will be looking at the sort of framework for prioritizing the provision of vaccine to Canadians. And there's no requirement or mandatory policy from the perspective of the federal government. It is not something that we've, provided, even in, for example, the last pandemic of 2009. We do account for the maximum number of Canadians who may wish to be vaccinated.
Alex, follow up.
Just moving to the I guess this is for Minister Bain, the rapid testing kits. Obviously, there was a hope of getting some from that Ottawa company, Spartan, I think, recently, that kind of fell through. When will we see, or when can we expect to see rapid testing kits actually in use in Canada with these new research agreements and all this?
Well, thank you very much for your question. When it comes to testing, we know that it's important for the restart of the economy to ramp up our testing. We've looked at Made in Canada solutions for making sure that we have sufficient reagent and swabs for lab testing. We've also put forward solutions for serology and test kits for that. What I announced today are low-cost point-of-care diagnostic test kits, and these are going to be used for clinics, airports, particularly for rural and remote communities. And the objective is to get quick, rapid test results. But this is early stages. This is a prototype with a proof of concept that's going to be developed. It still needs to be approved by Health Canada. So this is a bit of a long-term play. This is not something that's going to be up and running in the next few weeks. It'll take months. But the idea is to complement the other testing initiatives as well, and really to mobilize our innovative, skilled innovators across the country who are highly skilled at coming up with different solutions. And this is a byproduct of a challenge that we put out to industry to come up with new solutions. And you looked at saliva sample-based solutions, which are easier to administer, but we need to go through the appropriate due diligence, particularly with Health Canada, in order to make sure that we have the appropriate setup in place for clinics, for airports, for rural and remote communities. But this is a bit of a longer-term play.
Thank you, Minister. We'll now turn to the room. Mackenzie.
Hi, Minister Freeland. Mackenzie Gray with CTV News. The Prime Minister has mentioned, and Minister Duclos even mentioned in his remarks, that we should be better allies for Black Canadians. I think that many Black Canadians and many activists would agree that being a good ally means calling out people for what they perceive to be injustice. Why has the government not been more forceful in its reprimand of President Trump's approach to how the protests have gone, and in particular calling in the army to potentially deal with protesters?
Thank you for that question. It's a really important one. And I'd like to start by being very clear that racism exists here in Canada. As we heard Jean-Yves say a moment ago, systemic discrimination is real. Anti-Black racism is real and unconscious bias is real. As a Canadian politician, as a Canadian leader, my focus is on Canada, and it is on being very clear within our government and with Canadians that this is not a problem to which we are immune. It is a problem here in Canada, and it is our job today to listen to Canadians, to listen to Black Canadians, and it's time for us to act.
I must note, though, in the answers that, and the questions previous and the answers the Prime Minister gave and then the response you gave here, you haven't mentioned President Trump by name. Are you concerned about blowback from the U.S. if we are to get involved in an issue like this?
What I am concerned about, actually, is Canadian complacency. I think that it's really, really important for us to set our own house in order and for us to really be aware of the pain that anti-Black racism causes here in our own country, of the reality that we do have systemic discrimination here in Canada. And I think that we as Canadians, all of us, need to take this very traumatic moment for many people in the world as an opportunity to look at what we are doing in Canada and to work hard to do better.
Merci, Madame la Vice-Première Ministre. Opérateur.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Operator, one last question on the telephone, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, la dernière question, is from Mélanie Marquis avec La Presse. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Question from La Presse. Thank you very much. Hello to all. My question is for Ms. Freeland, having to do with the United States. Over the last few days, have you had any conversations with an American counterpart, such as Mr. Pompeo, in order to express Canada's concerns about what's happening south of our border? Answer. I did have dialogue with an American counterpart in the last few days. However, we discussed concerns about international trade and free trade. It was a very specific conversation.
We're in constant touch with our American partners. I very specifically have had some communication with American counterparts very specifically about trade issues.
Melanie, a follow-up? Yes. Ms. Freeland, as a follow-up, I would like to ask about the laser operation in Quebec's nursing homes. Has an agreement been established between the federal government and the province of Quebec?
C'est une très importante question.
Answer. That's a very important question. I would like to start by saying just how much I appreciate the vast amount of work that the women and men of the Canadian Forces have put in. I am proud of them, and I think all Canadians should thank the Canadian Armed Forces for what they are doing. I think we can say that we are talking about saving Canadians' lives here. As you know, we are discussing with Ontario and Quebec to determine how much more time the Canadian Forces will remain in place. The Prime Minister was clear that this is not a long-term solution. We must find solutions now, because the Canadian forces cannot stay there forever. We are working on resolving the situation with the provinces. Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. We have time for one last question.
Thank you. Merci. La prochaine question, next question, is from Catherine avec la presse canadienne. Please go ahead.
Canadian from the Canadian Press. Yes, hello to all of you. My question is for Ms. Anand and perhaps Minister Baines. You would like Canadians to be self-sufficient when it comes to personal protective equipment. Is Canada following the trajectory that was initially drawn? Are we still going to need to import materials from other countries such as China? Answer. I would like to start and then give the floor to Minister Baines. We have a constant flow of goods coming from various sources, both nationally and internationally, in order to maintain the supply chain. We have contracts with national and international suppliers, and we need to prioritize the maintenance of these orders of equipment for all Canadians. That is very important, both in the short and long term, and we are being aggressive and proactive in our approach for Canadians. Nav.
Merci, Anita.
Thank you, Anita. I agree with my colleague. We will continue to manufacture essential equipment. For instance, we have 700 businesses throughout Canada who are manufacturing essential equipment for Canadians. I am sure that our capacity will continue to grow.
Catherine, en suivi.
Catherine,
we're going to pull away from this federal briefing that is wrapping up, and I will wrap up with my colleagues Vashi Kapellas and David Cochrane. I will say the bit that stood out for me as potentially an encouraging, although in no way anything concrete behind it, the idea that Canada is working to procure 37 million syringes if there's a vaccine one day so that we can all get it was a bright light in an otherwise not the best day in terms of what people were having to talk about and deal with, which was primarily speeches around anti-Black racism or racism, both in this country and the United States. And that's where we started things off inside the House of Commons with speeches from all leaders, Vashi.
Yeah, speeches from all leaders that I found, one specific point echoed throughout all of them, and that was to again not sort of be in denial that this is only a problem in the United States, that it does exist here in Canada. There were slight variances in the approach, and I think at the end of the day there were some pushes, for example, from NDP leader Jagmeet Singh to see more concrete action in that vein, and promises from the Prime Minister to take more concrete action. So I think as far as following up in the days and the weeks to come, that's where I would be looking. I thought also it was interesting to see just a few minutes ago a question to the Deputy Prime Minister following up on the question to the Prime Minister from our colleague Tom Perry, in which he paused for about 20 seconds and then answered. It was all about what had happened in the United States, and specifically if there was a hesitancy in this follow-up question to Minister Freeland on the part of the federal government, on the part of her and the Prime Minister, to criticize the President because of what is at stake. She answered in very much a similar way as the Prime Minister and did not really acknowledge the actions of the President, but said, my interpretation of my job is to focus on what's happening here in Canada, and the idea that we don't deny that the existence of racism is here and we have to fight it. But she did not address, again, the actions taken by the President. She did pause a little bit, too, before she answered, just not as long as the Prime Minister.
I will say that the Prime Minister, the line that stuck out for me from the Prime Minister was, I'm sure the last thing you want to hear is a speech from another white politician, because, that's probably true true for a lot of people, but he said that he wanted to say something because his government wants to listen and understands the anger. But of course, Jagmeet Singh is the first leader of any political party who is a person of color. So his speech was a little different. It was certainly more emotional, given some of the lived experiences he's had. And I thought he made some interesting points, calling on the Prime Minister for some action. Generally, these are sort of speeches where you just talk about your own sort of thoughts and opinions on things, but he actually demanded some action from the government too, David.
Yeah, I thought Jagmeet Singh's speech was the most personal of the speeches, and certainly probably the most powerful of the speeches, you know, raising the very specific questions of how many more people are going to have to be asked to be allowed to breathe and asked to be allowed to live, and what will it take for people to take action. I'm tired of pretty speeches and want concrete actions. That's certainly, I think, what we're seeing south of the border in the United States, and I think perhaps it's encouraging to see that conversation taking place in the House of Commons. The challenge, I suppose, is whether that conversation extends beyond the scripted and well-timed and well-thought-out and written speeches of today, and does it move into actual concrete action which makes a difference in the lives of racialized Canadians. That's certainly the challenge and the test that all the leaders seem to be laying out for themselves in their speeches today. And as Jagmeet Singh said, it's going to take more than a pretty speech to have any kind of a meaningful effect. It was interesting too, I picked up on the same thing as Vashi when the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, was asked to comment on the United States. She said, as a Canadian politician, my focus is on Canada, which is an interesting answer from a former Minister of Foreign Affairs and also the Minister responsible for Canada-U.S. relations. Clearly, she has a lot of things to focus on that aren't just internal. But it seems quite clear from the interaction with the Prime Minister earlier, with the Deputy Prime Minister, and with the speeches that the government wants to speak very broadly on the issue of race and not specifically on the actions of the United States government, in particular the President, and they want to look inward at issues in Canada, things that they can control, and not get into a contest to be the loudest voice condemning the actions of our neighbor to the south. They're in a very difficult spot here, right? Trade is essential trade is happening. Medical supplies are coming from the United States. That border is closed right now, but it is also still a lifeline for this country in a pandemic. Very difficult for them to maybe satisfy the political urges of people who want them to say tough things about Donald Trump and still maintain the relations they need to keep those supplies coming.
And maybe even their own personal urges to say tough things about Donald Trump that in a political environment becomes obviously much more difficult. Thank you both very much for your coverage. I appreciate it. Vashi Kapelis, you can watch her tonight at 5 Eastern right here on CBC News Network, and David Cochran wherever he might turn up later today. Thank you both. I appreciate it very much. Again, just wrapping up our coverage here today, while it was a briefing about COVID-19, much of the focus today on a response by this government to the anti-racism protests here and in the United States. The Prime Minister says they are watching with horror and consternation what is unfolding in the U.S. I'm Rosemary Barton. Andrew Nichols picks up our coverage right now. This is CBC News Network. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.